Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I'm going to revisit a topic that I've made posts on multiple times, and I made a podcast, but it's been over a year now. So I think it's a good time to go back over it and just kind of give some updated thoughts to this topic. And again, it's going to be sex-based differences in fat loss, essentially. And I'm going to talk about how women specifically tend to have a little bit more of a stress response to low energy availability, energy deficit, whatever you would want to call it, right? I think those are interchangeable on there. So what that means is you'll have an idea of what you need to do from a fat loss perspective, and maybe some things that if you are a female that you've done in the past and maybe haven't worked from a fat loss perspective. And again, we will touch on the male side of things as well too. So this will be for men as well too, as we'll dive into some sex-based differences around that. But before we get into that, I just want to go over a couple things. So I have my body recomp workshop that I did. I do have the replay, and you'll learn everything you need to know about body recomp. And it's a 80 minutes lecture based video. And so the link to that is in the show notes. So if you want to grab that, check that out, learn everything you need to know about body recomp, that's exactly what that's about. So I think that will be super helpful for a lot of people to just get really, just kind of think of it as my 360 view of kind of my overall process and what I think towards body recomp, and again, who it's for, how to do it, the inputs that are important as well too in there. So definitely go and check that out and make sure you grab that. So again, the link to that is in the show notes. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So again, we're going to discuss how women have a higher stress response to energy deficits. And so what does that mean? How do we work around that? And we are just going to go into some sex-based differences in terms of fat loss there. Working with women, working with women and then also just diving more into the physiology for women. And I think this happens a lot, right? Where it's like fat loss, when women want to lose weight, it's usually, hey, you just eat less and you move more, right? And that is a good way to do it. But I do think that backfires for a lot of women, right? And so it needs to be, because women have a larger stress response to an energy deficit. We'll talk about what that means. In my experience, it needs to be more strategic. And most women don't struggle because they're not trying hard enough. It's because they have that larger stress response to calorie deficits, and the body's more protective of energy availability, right? So how much energy is coming in and stored energy on the body, right? So we're looking at, okay, how much is somebody expending? How much energy are they bringing in, right? Is there a mismatch there with that? And then also on top of it, the brain is also sensing, all right, how much stored energy do we have on the body, right? Because in a state where somebody maybe is slightly higher body fat levels, they just started a diet, you will obviously in the short term get that sort of hunger because your body's like, hey, we're not getting enough energy coming in. We probably need to bring in a little bit more, but it's not this overly aggressive signal, right? And anybody that's experienced fat loss can attest to that, right? It's like the beginning's a little bit easiest, things come off a little bit quicker. Yeah, maybe there's that adjustment period of eating a little bit less food, but it's usually something that's manageable, right? But as you get further and further into fat loss dieting and you've lost more and more weight and more body fat, you just find that it gets tougher, right? And again, this typically hits women a little bit more. Now, at the end of the day, inputs are super important. So if your inputs are not dialed in, like whether you're male or female, like you are going to have a stress response to a calorie deficit. It just tends to be a little bit larger in women. And then on top of it, the way that women typically diet often adds more stress to that, right? Because it is very focused on just seeing scale weight go down, eating really low calories, or just slashing them right off the bat. And then if they don't see weight loss from one day to the next, it goes down more. And then it's, oh, hey, on top of it, we also need to exercise a ton. You need to go do a bunch of boot camp style training. And then you also need to run 3 miles a day. And so again, it just adds even more and more stress onto a situation where your body is already fairly stressed, or there is a larger stress signal to that. What can make this even more complex is at higher body fat levels. And again, we're talking probably BMIs above 28, 29, 30, depending on what metabolic health looks like. Somebody hasn't exercised much, or again, there's also just a ton of stress in general. Like you also may find that there is some appetite dysregulation to where things can get noisy, right? And so that adds a layer of complexity to this as well too, because you could have higher body fat levels and you may just be at the beginning of a deficit, and you may find that your appetite is just dysregulated essentially, right? Like you tend to see that a bit more in higher body fat individuals on there. So again, just another layer of complexity to this entire situation. And okay, we know that everyone's going to have a stress response to a calorie deficit. It tends to happen a little bit more in women than in men. And then we know that low energy availability, whether in the short term or long term, can, again, you see it in the short term, but then again, as you lose more and more weight, you start to see the stress response increase. And that's because, again, women need to have higher levels of essential body fat. And really the main thing being, you have to grow a baby, right? Or at least that is one of the main things that women, again, from a physiological perspective, women will have to carry babies for 9 months, breastfeed, et cetera. Again, the body is the brain tends to just have a little bit more of a stress response to lower energy availability or that decreasing right there. And then on top of it, the menstrual cycle, like these are all things that can play a role in this process there. All right. And over time, that high stress load can slow fat loss, especially the leaner you get, because again, you're just going to have things that creep up that are going to make it tougher. If you just go through today's modern environment and again, your body's, all right, hey, we need to eat more calories, your brain's going to subconsciously push you to do that, it can just be very challenging. And then again, you also add in the fact that there is that larger stress response. Everybody has they have a stress bucket, and once that's overflowing, it can get tougher to stay on track from a fat loss perspective there. And then, so it can slow fat loss, and then it can negatively impact body composition, right? You lose weight, but you don't really necessarily like how you look. And then it can also make it really hard to maintain results after the deficit too. This isn't necessarily something that just happens during fat loss for women. It's also post-diet, post-energy deficits, where you're not necessarily out of the clear just because you're at maintenance calories. Depending on where your body fat levels are at, that noise could be a lot more overall as well too. So again, at the end of the day, fat loss still requires a calorie deficit, but I think the approach matters far more than people realize for women in particular. So just some things that we can look at here that will impact what does a high stress load on the body look like? And again, this can be dysregulated hunger, not to be confused with normal hunger when losing fat, because that is going to be part of the process. You do need some hunger if you're losing body fat. That's going to be your body being like, all right, or your brain being like, hey, what's going on? Where's that energy going? We need to eat more, right? So we know that. So you're going to have more hunger. However, dysregulated hunger is just essentially you can't ever fill up. You eat and then an hour later you're hungry again. Again, that is a sign that there's some dysregulated hunger going on and there's a high stress load on the body. Now, again, with any of these, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to make a change right off the bat, but you definitely, if you've experienced any of these things, while fat loss dieting, definitely want to look at the 7 things that I'm about to go over here in a little bit there. Waking up in the middle of the night. So again, you consistently wake up between 2 and 4 a.m. You kind of just wake up and you have that kind of wired feeling there. And also keep in mind, this high stress load can also show up outside of a deficit, but this is again in the context of if you're in a deficit. Low energy, but feeling wired. So you're just kind of tired and you don't want to move a lot, but you're also feeling wired. That's a sign that you have that high stress load on the body. Workouts feel flat or weaker. This is where something like meal timing can come into play. And when we're in a deficit, we may find that performance feels not as good as it does when you're at maintenance. However, if you have that consistency of just feeling super flat or weaker and it never goes away, and we improve meal timing, definitely a sign that we have the high stress load on the body. You have more cravings and just general irritability, more water retention. So it's like you just feel like you're just retaining water. Yeah, you're eating a deficit, but you're just retaining that water. Things are not going down from that perspective. Again, this can show up in the menstrual cycle, right? That luteal phase, the phase leading up to the bleed. That is also a time when you may retain a little bit more water, but that is a sign that there likely is a little bit more stress on the body during that time. Bloating, digestive issues. So if you feel super bloated despite eating less, you have some digestive issues. Again, a sign that we have high stress load on the body. Low libido, you're consistently lower than a 6 to 7 out of 10 mood-wise from day to day. Fat loss is stalling, even though you're super consistent. Again, I would always double check that. But if you have been super consistent and things are just not trending down, again, a sign that we have high stress load on the body. And then low HRV plus increased resting heart rate. So a lot of times in a deficit, you'll see resting heart rate come down a little bit. And so if you do see it come down and then it starts to come back up, definitely a sign that you have a higher stress load on the body. And then again, that lower HRV, lower than what you typically have. So you want to get your baseline. And if it's lower than that, a sign that you definitely have a little bit more stress on the body here. And okay, a lot of these things are going to happen in a deficit, right? So if you get one of these one time, it's not problematic. If you start to see these pop up more and more for extended periods of time, that's where we maybe need to look at our approach, what we're doing here. And again, all these things we'll talk about here will help out with that. But again, the big thing is not like, oh crap, I woke up one time at 3 a.m. I got a high stress load. I just need to completely change what I'm doing. That's not necessarily the case, but it's definitely a sign that you need to look into your structure and strategy that you are having towards fat loss. Again, if that continues to happen, even if it happens one night, I don't think it's a bad idea to potentially look at your strategy, but again, if it's starting to happen more regularly with any of these things, that's where it can become problematic there. And like I said, something like water retention, again, we have to, and even bloating and digestive issues, again, we have to understand too, like when you are menstruating, like I said, that luteal phase, that week or two leading up to the actual bleed, like that's where you have to also understand that some of these things could be because of that, but it still is a sign that, hey, we may need to work a little bit more on the recovery side of things. We may need to adjust our strategy during that time specifically for you there, because really the main takeaway with all this so far is if we just keep trying to be super aggressive, trying to push harder, but we have this high stress level on the body. That's where we need to take a step back and see, hey, do I maybe need to not just necessarily push through and push harder? Do I need to work on other things here? And that's obviously what we're going to go over here there. So, all right, let's talk about some things that we need to look at. If you're experiencing those regularly, or you have in the past when you fat loss dieted, these are things that I would point you towards to look at. And again, I work on these with all my women clients, female clients, making sure that we have these in check and we watch these, right? So I think the first one is be careful with large deficit / quicker weight loss. And it's not inherently bad. It's just that, again, the larger the deficit is and the quicker that weight loss is week over week. The first week, not necessarily, we're not worried about that. But again, multiple weeks, that's where you want to potentially look at things. Again, that means the quicker we lose weight, that means we're in a larger deficit and we're likely going to have a little bit more of a stress response to that. And so that can, again, show up with any of those things that I was just talking about. And so, so we just want to look at that. So again, larger deficits can trigger greater metabolic adaptation. So your body, the larger that deficit is, it may adapt elsewhere from a total daily energy expenditure perspective. So it's, let's say you're super aggressive, you're eating 1,200 calories. For some women, you may find that now you subconsciously move less, right? And so you see a big decrease there from that energy expenditure side of things, right? Somebody may have their thyroid downregulate a little bit more than somebody else, right? And again, this will show up when we're in that larger deficit, right? Energy intake is way lower than our energy expenditure there. And so what happens is you usually see that total daily energy expenditure side of things, how many calories you're burning in a day, decrease in some form or fashion there. Again, we now start to have a higher increased stress on the body. And so that means we have to start to now regulate other things outside of what we're doing, right? We need to reduce what's getting poured into that stress bucket because there's that greater stress response there. It can start to impact bone health, right? The larger that is. I think bone health is going to be something that's more of a long-term issue, not necessarily in the short term, but when we start to get into older 40s, 50s, 60s, that may start to be something that we want to definitely watch for sure. There, you really need to be on top of your micronutrients and your nutrition in that situation there. You need to weight train, et cetera. And you're obviously going to see that increased hunger and cravings. That's going to be your brain's response to that. And it can make fat loss tougher over time, right? For all the reasons I mentioned there. And so a more modest calorie deficit tends to work better for women to reduce stress on the body and prevent those plateaus. So it may be a little bit slower weight loss on the scale, but you may be setting yourself up much better on there with that. And with that modest calorie deficit, women, because they have higher levels of essential body fat, probably are at a higher likelihood of recomping, right? Having that simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain, which is great. And so if you do quicker weight loss, so I'm not saying not to do quicker weight loss, there are some scenarios where a rapid fat loss approach could be beneficial for you. You'll need to shorten the duration and you need to focus on everything else in this post. So everything else that I'm going to talk about here in this episode is going to be even more important, right? You're going to really need to nail your inputs during this time and you're going to have to shorten that duration and you're probably going to have to use more refeed days and or maintenance calorie weeks if you're going to take a more rapid approach, right? That's a way to take some stress off the body. So around 0.5 to 1% of body weight loss per week is a good number to aim for, which is going to equate to roughly a 250 to 500 calorie deficit from your maintenance calories, give or take on there. That's probably going to get you within that. You start to go higher than that in terms of the calorie deficit, and that's where you may run into some of these issues. Generally speaking, I want to go a bit more moderate, but there are some scenarios where you could go with a larger deficit. You just have to focus on everything else, shorten the duration, and make sure that overall stress load is managed. So to go off that, body fat levels do really matter here. So again, it's not just necessarily the size of the deficit that matters. Your current body fat levels play a massive role in overall stress on the body. So the leaner you get, the more stress it tends to place on the body, especially for women, right? We talked earlier how women tend to have, the brain tends to react more to lower energy availability in women compared to men. There's usually, again, that sort of that kind of the more of a brake system built in with that, which means the same approach that worked earlier on often becomes harder to tolerate as body fat levels drop. And so your approach needs to become more strategic. So this could be something where at the beginning of your fat loss phase, when you have higher body fat levels, you could be a bit more aggressive. And then as you get deeper into it, you probably are going to start to have to manage your training intensity. You're going to have to manage how aggressive the deficit is. You're going to have to watch these things even more as you get leaner and leaner. But genetics also play a role here where this point is for each person. So some women can handle being leaner with fewer issues while others will feel it much sooner. So there's a huge genetic component to this where some women may find that once they get close to 20% body fat, their body really starts to push back. For some people, it could be closer to 16 to 18%. For some unlucky people, it could be 25%. So it really does depend. And then that's where, again, if you do start to run into these issues, which I take you back to the first thing, that's where we just have to now be more strategic with what we're doing from a day-to-day standpoint. It's not just, oh, hey, keep pushing through, keep slashing your calories, keep moving more. It is hey, we probably have to, again, be more strategic, take more breaks, etc. with this. And again, this shows up the leaner somebody gets there. So like I said, this often starts to show up around 20 to 25% body fat in women. But again, that range can vary based on habits, because that does matter. So your inputs do matter a lot. Again, you take somebody with good genetics and great inputs in terms of all the things we're talking about here today, they can push to those lower levels, where someone that doesn't maybe have the greatest inputs and genetically their body will start to fight things a bit more. Again, that's where you could end up at that 25% body fat. That's where you'll start to see some issues. But also keep in mind, where are you coming from? I think the higher you start it without taking any breaks, both of those also will impact how much of a stress response you'll have. So what I mean by that is if you start at 40%, you haven't taken a break, you got down to 25%, that's going to be much harder, and your body will fight back more on that than somebody who started at 30% and went down to 25%. And I think, again, you can look at it two ways. You can look at it, did you do it in one straight shot? You just lost it straight through. You didn't take any breaks. Again, there will be more of a stress response to that. Or have you taken breaks multiple times? There still may be a stress response the lower you get, but that noise will be a little bit less if you've taken breaks along the way and you've done some of these things that we've talked about here today. So number 3, this means we need to spend less time dieting overall. So we need to spend more time at maintenance calories, which is going to help support your metabolism. You're not going to have those metabolic adaptations, which again, if you do have some sort of metabolic adaptation, that tends to go away once you bring yourself back to maintenance, or you get to the body fat levels where your body feels a lot better. And so, but maintenance calories and eating enough carbs and enough diet and a good diet quality can also reduce stress on the body, right? It takes that stressor away. And so now that bucket's more filled. It probably increases your bucket a little bit, and now you have more inputs that you can put in, right? You can fill that with whatever you want. You can fill that with more work stuff. You can fill in with more life stuff, or you can fill in with more training stuff. It just depends on what you want to do. And so we need to incorporate more building phases throughout the year, and we need to use diet breaks and refeed days strategically and more often for women. So we really need to watch these things there. Again, across the board, you need a calorie deficit, like I've said multiple times. And men, you still are going to run into these issues, especially the leaner you get. But we probably can take a more grip it and rip it approach with men, and we can spend a bit more time dieting depending on where their body fat levels are at, right? Because again, these things do matter across the board for men and women. But again, just women in particular are going to see a little bit of a stronger response there to that. So again, we just need to spend less time dieting overall. If you typically are just dieting all year long, we need to start to reduce that to take some stress off the body, because if you do that, you're probably making fat loss harder for you. You're going to have to work harder to see any amount of fat loss, versus somebody who does spend time at maintenance calories throughout the year. They probably can lose fat a little bit more efficiently and feel like they're going downhill with it versus feeling like you got to push uphill with it. That's probably the best way I can describe that there. So again, we just need to spend less time dieting overall. 4 is, hey, we need to just double down on lifestyle habits, right? Because dieting adds stress, lifestyle factors matter even more to manage. They matter even more. And so we need to manage stress load on the body, right? That's ultimately what we're looking at here. If you're not sure on the stress load concept, I did my stress bucket episode last week. So go and check that out if you want a little bit of a refresher on that. But again, we need to prioritize quality sleep. We need to balance the nervous system, right? We need to have the right parasympathetic versus sympathetic inputs, right? So parasympathetic is your rest and digest. Sympathetic is your fight or flight. We need to balance that out. If we're always tipped more in the sympathetic side of things, your bucket is could potentially be smaller, but it's also going to be filled up a bit more there. And so we need to make sure that we balance that out on there. Again, you can look at things like HRV, resting heart rate there. We need to optimize our circadian health, and we just need to improve our overall environment. So think about your circadian health. What is that? That's getting some light as early as possible. That's limiting how much bright light you get in the evening, consistent sleep and wake time, making sure stimulant use is earlier in the day, right? Caffeine would fall into that. From an exercise perspective, just make sure you're not training super, super hard an hour before bed. These are some things that we can do to optimize our circadian health. Also, make sure you get into that more relaxed state in the evening there. So again, we need to double down on these things. We need to double down on sleep. And that's going to allow you to, if these are in check, that's probably going to increase your stress bucket, and you're not going to have as many things getting poured into that there, because poor circadian health is a stressor on the body, and that's going to add to it, right? So if you are you're sitting on your phone at 11 p.m. in your bed, you're getting stressed. Now you wake up in the middle of the night. Now you're not getting good quality sleep. Again, that's going to lower your stress bucket, but it's also going to add some stress to it, right? So that's now less capacity, and now there's less capacity to your body to prioritize fat loss, right? At that state, it's going to be like, all right, hey, we got to get rid of this stress on the body versus actually trying to lose body fats in that situation. It's just going to be a bit more thrifty. I can't think of the word here, but it's just going to be, man, I cannot think of this word right now. Selfish would be the best way I can say it, right? It's just going to be a little bit more selfish with losing body fats there. All right. So next one's going to be, because there's a higher stress response to a calorie deficit, you can expect more weight fluctuations, right? This is just going to be one because of the greater stress response. Again, that in itself. So the more aggressive it is, the leaner you are, et cetera. Like and there's that large, and again, life stress, et cetera, any other stressors that you're placing on your body, that system can get a little bit out of whack. And so you could be experiencing more water weight fluctuations, right? But there's also the hormonal shifts and menstrual cycle changes as well, too, that are also going to play a role in this, right? Women tend to, like I said, hold on to a little bit more water. Their body weight comes up slightly in that luteal phase, that the week or two, or during the time, like right before the bleeding, right? Like that's what you'll typically see happen there. So the key is to not overanalyze every weigh-in and slash calories further when the scale doesn't go down, because what's going to happen in that situation, right? Let's say you're the week leading up to it, you're starting to feel things, you're not feeling great. Now your freaking water weight now you're hanging on to water. Now I'm not losing weight, so you're stressing about that. You're already have a higher stress response because of the phase of the cycle. And then now what do you try and do? You try to move more and you try to slash your calories more. Again, now we're just adding more and more stress to the system, and it's this vicious cycle there, right? So we need to make sure that we don't do that there. And so this is why relying on the scale is misleading, right? So we need to also track measurements, photos, and biofeedback, and look at trends over time versus just one single weigh-in there. Diet quality is extra important. So a lack of vitamins and minerals is going to put extra stress on the body, which in turn can affect your metabolism and recovery instead of just slashing calories, right? We do need to make sure we are well balanced in terms of our micronutrients. Here's a big one. Zinc is something to look at as well too. B vitamins, these are all things that we need to look at there, right? If we're lacking any of those, if we have any holes in our nutrition, that is going to put extra stress on the body. And again, it's probably going to have some downstream impacts on your total daily energy expenditure, depending on where you're at there. Now, this doesn't mean you need to overanalyze every last little micronutrient that you have, but it is worth looking at. I love to use Chronometer for this just to get an idea, right? Of, all right, you look at this person's nutrition report for the last week and it's like they're getting 10% of their iron that they need. That's a sign that it's like, hey, if you also pair that with feelings of low energy, and then you look at someone's blood work and they're also low ferritin, these are all signs that would be something to potentially look at there, right? And that is going to impact your motivation. That's going to impact your energy levels, which in turn is going to impact your ability to stay on track with your fat loss phase, right? So there's probably direct effects, but also indirect. But we're also looking at a balanced diet of macros too, right? Like we need to make sure we're getting enough protein. Protein is going to be super important in this process. We need to make sure we're getting enough. You don't have to get 3 grams per pound of body weight, but you probably don't want to be at 50 grams of protein per day. We do need to make sure we get enough. And that sweet spot probably for women is anywhere between 120 and 140. I think that would be a sweet spot for most people. Obviously, if you're on the low end of body weight, you might need to go a little bit less. If you're at the higher end of body weight, you may need to go a little bit higher, but I think for most women, 120 to 140 is super solid number to aim for there. But carbs too, right? I'm not a fan of ultra low carb diets for too long women. Now, depending on where your calories need to get into an energy deficit, you probably will need to drop carbs a bit, but I also don't think you need to go 20 grams of carbs for extended periods of time. I think that, again, has more stress on the body for women in particular there. So we need to be careful that we're not slashing out any one macro for extended periods of time. Especially the leaner you get and the more active you are, you really don't want to be low carb then at that point. But also, I think ultra low fat for extended periods of time is not good either. So if you're looking at your macros and you're at 10 to 20 grams of fats for extended periods of time, you need to look at that, right? So there is this balance that we need to have, especially when we are working with lower calories there. We also want to make sure you get enough fiber, but you don't necessarily need to just have 80 grams of fiber per day. You probably want to be in that, I think, 15 to 25 gram range is super solid to aim for there. And again, that strategic supplementation too, right? Depending on, hey, what are you consuming in terms of your micronutrients? And then what does your blood work say, right? Is there something that we need to potentially add in? And this can help regulate stress on the body, right? Because again, if we're lacking in any of these, again, whether we have an imbalance of macros for too long, micronutrients, et cetera, that will start to add more stress to the body. And it's just probably not going to be in the most efficient spot to lose body fats there. And again, there's that direct effect, but also that indirect effect. In terms of supplements, I think creatine is going to be super helpful here from a lean body mass perspective. It helps with recovery. So I think making sure you get enough creatine. Magnesium glycinate is a good supplement. Fish oil with enough DHA and EPA, and then some vitamin D, right? And then I think a good quality multivitamin in a energy deficit is a good base. Again, maybe it's not the full multivitamin, maybe you're taking half, but just having a base of all your micronutrients, I think is a safe thing to take in a deficit there. Now, those aren't universal rules. It does depend on the person, what their diet looks like, what issues they're having in their blood work, but those are some things to consider in that standpoint there. So again, we want to have that good diet quality, and we don't want to just, we need to look at that. And again, I do this through food logs. Somebody will inevitably ask how many carbs. Again, I think if you're under 100 grams of carbs for extended periods of time, that's where you can run into some issues. Maybe you do have to decrease them a bit. But again, being super low in one macro or micro for extended periods of time is where you can run into some issues there. Then we obviously need protein for lean body mass and the satiety side of things as well too. All right, the next one here is going to be, we need to monitor training intensity and volume. So more isn't always better, right? So chasing calorie burn and maxing out every session does increase stress. So in a deficit, recovery capacity is lower because the bucket, your stress bucket may be a bit lower when we're consuming less calories, but you also have the fact that a calorie deficit will take up some of that bucket as well too, right? So it's a double whammy there with that. And so that's just less capacity for you to train and then recover from that training. Again, you could train a lot, but now if that bucket's overflowing, again, now the bucket's going to get even smaller and that stress response is just going to continue it's a vicious cycle from that standpoint, right? So we want to train hard, but we need to avoid constantly pushing intensity and burning the most calories for fat loss, right? So we have to monitor our training intensity and volume. I always tell people you don't necessarily need to slash volume, but this is definitely not the time that you're going to do more. So if times when you're feeling enough, if you're training X amount and then you go into fat loss and you train more, that's probably a big mistake. It probably needs to be either the same, depending on where your volume's at, or slightly lower there. And that's from a weight training perspective, right? From a cardio perspective, we really need to watch more so the intensity than the volume. We can do high volumes of cardio in a fat loss phase, but we have to really watch intensity the more volume we do. And again, the leaner you are and the longer you've been dieting, et cetera, right? But you could do a decent amount of cardio, but again, you really have to have it be lower intensity. Maybe it is more steps. But in saying that, no matter what, higher and higher volumes of movement, cardio, et cetera, is going to start to add stress to your bucket, and you'll need to make sure that it's all well managed there. So again, we still want to focus on progressing, but this isn't the time for super high training volumes and just pushing your training and trying to burn the most calories, being super beat up in your training. Again, people associate that with fat loss, but that is a mistake. So we do want to make sure that we don't do that, right? We need to manage our training intensity because again, it's just going to add stress and it's that vicious cycle, right? But again, a lot of people tend to just ramp up their training and train super hard in fat loss. But again, we need to watch that, especially in women during fat loss. So what about men, right? And so again, men tend to have less of a stress response to energy deficits due to hormonal differences and body fat needs, right? Again, men don't have to grow baby. There's no cycle-related shifts, right? So you're not going to have those water weight fluctuations as much. And we have lower essential body fat needs compared to women. Again, probably comes back to reproduction more than anything, but men just need to be able to do the deed. Again, but if men get super low in body fat percentage, like their libido will go down, right? And again, probably a sign, and testosterone will trend down, right? And so probably a sign that you're not in the optimal position to have a baby, but men really just need to do the deed and that's it, right? That's our work that we have to put in for this. It's definitely way more work for women than it is men on there. So again, you can start to see where like the cost to that is a lot lower and there's less of a stress response to energy deficits, but men will run into that as well too, just because again, if we think from an evolutionary standpoint, like obviously today's world, we have plenty of food available. Thousands of years ago, we didn't. And so anytime there's an energy deficit, the brain is going to be like, whoa, what is going on here? We got to slow this down. But it's less noisy in men for a period of time. But again, it does get noisy as you get leaner and leaner there. So what does this mean? Men can tolerate slightly larger deficits. Body fat plays a big role here. I think the higher body fat somebody is for men, the more aggressive they can be with fat loss, right? And they can take fewer diet breaks and times at maintenance there. And saying that, men are a little bit of a higher risk of muscle loss in a deficit. So like you still need to make sure you eat enough protein. You can't just go crazy with it. Like you still need to have good inputs across the board. So you do need to watch that. And again, there's fewer weight fluctuations, right? So there's less noise in the process. So it's more just, hey, a guy decides to eat less, they're going to see their weight trend down. Women decide to eat less. One, they usually don't have as much body weight, but it's also just because of the stress response. It may not just be like, oh, hey, you're going to lose a bunch of weight there right off the bat, right? But again, chronic stress, poor recovery, and excessive dieting still backfires for both men and women here. And so women just need a more strategic approach to avoid unnecessary stress. They can slow down fat loss. So again, I think men can probably push lower carb for a bit longer, and I'm okay with that. You still want to watch. We want to make sure, like, same thing still applies, right? It's just we probably have a little bit more wiggle room in terms of what we can do. Men can have a little bit more of a grip it and rip it approach to fat loss, but no matter what, whether you're male or female, you are going to run into issues from a low energy availability standpoint there. So to sum all this up, essentially, look, fat loss is going to require a calorie deficit. There's some people that say, oh, that doesn't, it's different for women. No, it still requires a calorie deficit. Unfortunately, for some women, not only do you have to get to lower calorie amounts, just usually based on body size. But again, there is that larger stress response. Obviously, getting to those lower calorie amounts is tough in today's modern environment. So that's certainly the case. They're having a little bit less muscle relative overall compared to men. Women can build muscle just as easily as men. It's just all relative to their body size. And then understand that, hey, women will tend to have less muscle mass just because, again, of body size, but also the body fat ranges that we discuss, right? And so again, that's going to put you at somewhat of a disadvantage from that perspective compared to men, right? And then there's also the body size side of things there. And again, for a given deficit, it's going to just generally be more stressful to women than it is to men, all things considered, right? Obviously, all these things we talked about today will definitely make, you could take a male with a 250 calorie deficit versus a female. The female is dialing in all her inputs and it may not be as stressful. But if you put everything is the same, you may find that women generally will have a little bit more of a stress response to that, right? The body's going to be like, whoa, it's just going to push back a bit more for women there. And so really, it's not to, because there's that greater response, the goal isn't to just eat less and train a bunch. It's to manage overall stress while driving fat loss and improving body composition. With my women, I have to just generally check in a bit more, get a little bit more feedback. Hey, how are you feeling? Looking at their biofeedback again, how do they feel from day to day? Their general motivation, hunger, how's training performance? Asking about the menstrual cycle. Is that regular? Is it not? And so just checking in on those biofeedback markers is more important. And so really then figuring out, all right, hey, for you, again, we may have to have more refeed days at maintenance compared to men, right? We just need to incorporate more of those. You may have to use a diet break more often. Your weight loss just may not be as quick as somebody else, right? And so we're just constantly figuring out, all right, what's the client's biofeedback? Are they seeing results? Then, hey, we're probably in a good spot. But if one of those are off, definitely a sign that we need to look into this and we just need to be on top of it a bit more. You could be on more of the reactive side of things, or you could be more proactive. More proactive would be, hey, we have built-in refeed days once a week. We have built-in refeed days twice a week. Reactive is, hey, how are you feeling? Okay, hey, you're noticing that you're having a little bit more stress overall on the body, right? All those things we talked about earlier. Maybe tomorrow we need to take a refeed day. And you can have a combination of that too, right? It doesn't necessarily have to just be that, like, it doesn't have to necessarily be either or. It can be both implemented into a fat loss phase. But we also need to just spend less time fat loss dieting overall. So again, we have to be careful with larger deficits, time spent in a deficit, and body fat levels. All those things are going to be things that we need to focus on there. One final note on this, like there's always going to be outliers and exceptions to the rule. So some women may just have a genetic predisposition that isn't as concerned with lower energy availability, right? So we're talking deficits and lower body fat levels there. Someone may be like, hey, I don't experience this. Well, that's great. Like that's why we want to track results and we want to look at biofeedback, because those are the most important things there. Like we have to take into consideration, how is your body actually responding? Because again, these are averages and it may not be the case for every single person there. The one thing I will say on this though is, for some people, if you tend to be someone that trains a lot, you have a lot of things going on in your life, you tend to be someone that probably just pushes through things and you ignore these things. I would say that a lot of people think they're the exception to the rule, but when you dive into it more, you're not, right? These things are creeping up and you just may not be noticing it there. So again, this could happen in the short term, right? You may have people that can push through in the short term, but then in the long term, it adds up there. So I think there's a time thing where it's like, it's not just black or white of, hey, it impacts you or it doesn't. It could be, hey, it doesn't impact you right now. Again, when you look at your whole life, like maybe you are able to push through, but then obviously as you get further in age, you get more responsibilities now, things that maybe you were able to push through before, now you're not able to, right? And so I think we always need to look at, okay, just because I could do something previously, I'm in a completely different period of time, but then also the maybe wear and tear of pushing through 4 years is also catching up, right? So you're always in a different state, and that's why we always have to reevaluate what we're doing here. And so again, if you're not seeing the results you want, or you're not feeling as good as you can be, like, again, that's just a sign that you need to reevaluate where you're at. So again, just understand this is generally what's going to happen. You'll listen to this and you do need to be more strategic, but some people may be able to push through more. Like I said, though, I think that's less often than people think there. So hope this episode was helpful. If you guys found this episode to be helpful, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find it. And then if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active on social media. And I will chat with you guys next time.